Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So if we know so much about how the brain works, why is so much learning still designed in ways that ignore it? So how can we leverage what neuroscience experts know about the brain to design learning that actually sticks? In this episode, we're diving into what neuroscience can teach us about how people and organizations really learn, not just in theory, but in practice. We'll explore how memory works, how we build skills and retain knowledge, and even the role of exercise in boosting cognitive performance. We've wanted to run an episode on neuroscience and learning for ages because it's a critical part of change and organizational effectiveness. So in our search for a leading expert, we came across the outstanding and accessible work of Stella Collins. Stella is a specialist and consultant in the compelling field of neuroscience. She's an accomplished and renowned expert in the practical application of science-based learning for business performance. And in that time, Stella has trained thousands of professionals in a career spanning 25 years. Stella is on a mission to create a world where every minute spent learning is worth it. And this really matters because time to learn in our ever faster moving organizations is at a premium. Stella is an evangelist for effective evidence-based learning. And through her work, she has challenged us to rethink traditional learning. Her book, Neuroscience for Learning and Development, has been translated into 4 languages and is actually in its 3rd edition. Is that right, Stella?
That's right. Yep.
People are really enjoying that, clearly. Her LinkedIn learning course has had more than 50,000 participants, and Stella is a really renowned keynote speaker and also host of Mind the Skills Gap podcast. Naturally, with someone of Stella's experience, she also has a huge number of professional qualifications and academic qualifications. She has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a Master's of Science in Human Communication, and she's also a Fellow of the Institute of Training and Occupational Learning and founder of the Brain Friendly Learning Group. So we're absolutely delighted to have you join us, Stella. Thank you so much for making time for us.
We're very excited to have you with us. We've got lots of things we want to talk about. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about the work that you're doing and the work you do with organisations.
So I do a lot of consulting work. I started as a trainer, a genuine trainer, but I think I always use this kind of evidence-based, the science-based approach that I'd picked up through my universities and studies and just my complete interest in the brain. So I do consulting, I run learning impact audits, I advise on how best to get the most from the learning that happens. I still train people, I love training people. I coach individuals, I coach sort of executives in organizations to think about how they can get better impact. And I do keynotes to kind of inspire, awaken awareness, and nudge people perhaps to diving deeper.
Just to take us back to first principles, neuroscience is a word that's mentioned a lot and a lot of people talk about it. Can we just define it for people so that we're all kind of starting from the same page in terms of what we mean by neuroscience?
Yeah, so I have quite a broad definition for neuroscience. Scientifically, it really is the kind of the physiology of how our brains, fit together and work. But my definition is broader, so that includes, the physiology, definitely very important, but also cognitive psychology, organizational psychology, the whole psychology field, the psychology of learning, the science of learning, and also because even though now AI is super popular, AI has been around for a long time, and AI as a part of learning, connected to learning, has been around for a long time. AI has influenced learning science has influenced AI, so that's also an important part of it. And then the tech comes in, but it's really the science of how people learn effectively.
And why should leaders and organisations pay attention to neuroscience if they're not already? How can it help them? What's the benefit?
Because if you're trying to train people, if you're trying to change behaviours, if you're trying to change processes, whatever you're trying to change in an organisation, you are asking people to change, what's going on in here and their bodies. Our brains and bodies are intimately connected. If you're trying to change that, it really helps if you know something about it. I'd never suggest anybody, needs to become a neuroscientist themselves, but just having some basic understanding of neuroplasticity, the time it takes for learning, the processes that have to take place in terms of, how people actually go from knowing nothing to knowing something to being able to do things, because that's what we really need people to be able to do in the work context. So I think that's the kind of, the context of it.
Yeah, and I think just to signpost people to your book, it's well worth a read if you're interested in that. I've read it. I read paper copies with lots of post-it notes. I've read this on my Kindle, so I can't show you all the highlights I made to sort of go through it, but there's so much in it that's worth getting into the hands of, I think,
I was actually
practitioners.
really pleased recently. Somebody had read it and kind of wrote to me saying they'd read it. And what they said they really liked was that I'd kind of employed my own principles to try and make the book as accessible as it can be.
Yeah, it's very accessible. I was saying to Garen, it's not one of those where you sit there and go, this is really hard work. It's not. It's really accessible. So, and as part of that, you've talked about the gear model that you've developed. So can you just take us through what that is and how that's useful?
So the gear model is a learning methodology. It's a way of beginning to design and deliver and think about learning. And it starts with, and if you imagine, what you've got to imagine is you've got 4 gears, 4 cogs, and between those cogs winds a sort of a thread. And at the end of that thread is a little rocket. And the rocket is about learning transfer. That's about making sure, that's the impact. That's where you want people to be, that they're flying in their jobs, in their careers, in their roles, with these new skills that they've mastered. This line that runs through it is motivation. Because if we don't have people motivated to learn, it doesn't matter how fantastic the training is, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, nothing matters. If they're not motivated, they don't know why they need to learn, not very much is going to happen. So this motivation needs to happen throughout a learning journey. So it's all about learning taking place over time. And there are times in a learning journey where, it's a bit tough. You're not getting it right. You're failing. You've practiced and you're still not, you still feel you're not there. Because, mastering a skill or even mastering knowledge is not it's not a one-off event. It's not a magic wand. You can just wave and think, hurrah, we've learned. So you've got the rocket, you've got the line that runs through it, the thread, and then you've got the cogs that connect together. And the first one is guide. So G for guide. And that's about the information or the experience or the something you need to kick off your learning. And that needs to be structured and well organized and accessible for people, and preferably connect to something that they already know, because we know from learning science that, working from where you are is much easier than starting from something completely new. So that guide part is about making sure that you've designed stuff and you've given people the opportunity to get to grips with something at the right level for where they are, and that it's scaffolded, structured, and not cognitively overloading, for instance. And then you've got the E, which is the experiment. And the experiment is when they've got some information, they've had an experience, and they want to continue. And they've now got to start thinking, okay, well, I don't want to press that button in the real world yet. I don't want to have that conversation with my real manager yet, but actually maybe I do want to practice, because that practice, but still within that safe environment. I want to just see what happens if I do this or if I do that. So it's that experimental phase, which very often it can be a workshop, it can be in the technical world, it can be a sandbox environment, it can be role play with AI. That's a fantastic way to test things out these days. It can be all sorts of things, but you're experimenting. And then you've got the apply part, and that's the scary part. That's the bit where you have to go back into the workplace, or you may still be in the workplace. You're in the workplace and you actually start applying it. You start implementing what you've learned. And from that, you need to make sure you reflect on it yourself. You need to get plenty of feedback to see, how am I progressing? How am I doing? And, the more feedback you can get, the better. So that application piece, and that's the bit that organizations are often challenged with. Busy managers, we know, Laura Overton's just published a really good article about, the role managers play. We know managers or immediate supervisors play a really strong role. So you need to have them involved in that too, because if you get back from learning something and your immediate organizational support person is just like, yeah, well, that's just something, that was you went on a course for that. We're just going to carry on doing it normally here. That's really, really demoralizing and doesn't help people. So the application piece, hugely important. And then you've got the retain, which kind of has to also run through it, but just for the purpose of making it easier to remember. The retain is, how do you make sure you maintain this knowledge, new knowledge and new skills for the long term? Because our brains are designed to forget, or they evolved to forget. They're not, because learning is actually very energy consumptive on our brains are more inclined to forget that, if I don't need to know this, I won't remember it. So it's how you make sure that people remember the key knowledge and the key skills. And that's about things like spaced practice, spaced repetition, interleaving and things like that, to make sure that people actually retain the knowledge and skills.
Okay, good. I've got lots of
I
questions.
know you go. Tell the questions you've got.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting what you're saying, because you can, as you're sort of laying out that model, you like, I'm starting rolling, like, because we see a lot of training that's delivered in organizations, and there is an incredible amount that's invested in the world in training and development. Like, even if you just take leadership, for example, there's billions, it's billions of dollars of industry. But you can already start to, if you don't apply those principles, it just doesn't work, does it? So an example that we see quite a lot is, because we do lots of work with organizations about ways of working and effectiveness. So a lot of organizations invest in things like crucial conversations training, which in theory, they're brilliant courses. They're really well designed. But when you ask, is it actually having an impact? Are people actually having those conversations? And they're not, but they really enjoyed the training.
Yeah.
What?
And enjoyable training is, it's a joy. It's lovely, but there's no evidence that it has any impact on whether people make the change, because the training is important. If you enjoy the training, you're more likely to apply something in the workplace. But if you don't get the support to do it, so I talked about transfer, and there are three, there's a lot of things that impact transfer, but there are three main pillars. One is that the learner, I've talked about motivation, has to want to apply that stuff at work. And something like crucial conversations, that's a scary thing to do, because crucial conversations are seen as something that, the conversations that you have to have that are hard. Actually, the crucial conversations are the easy ones you have first, that help you build the skills that then make it okay that I'm so good at having conversations, I can even have the more challenging ones. So the learner motivation, that's hugely important. Then the design of the program itself has to be far more than enjoyable. It has to help people it has to be performance focused. It has to be helping people take those skills and use them in the workplace. And then the other piece is the organizational support. Is everybody around you, helping you have that organizational support? A really good example of this, and it was a kind of crucial conversations piece of training I did with a company once, and they were very open to, we know we've done lots of training before and we know it's not stuck. So how are we going to help each other have these conversations? And it was around resilience, and it was kind of commenting when they thought people were feeling not resilient, when they thought they were feeling, and that's a difficult conversation to have, but crucial. And somebody in the group, I asked openly in the group, how are we going to make sure you sustain this commitment to have these conversations? And they said, we have to have some kind of a symbol so that you can ask somebody a conversation. You can ask somebody if they're okay, but you've got to have a sort of a symbol that I'm genuinely asking here. I'm not just asking in a kind of general way. So I'm genuinely wanting. And we came up with the idea of Snickers bars. I have no idea why. But they then realized that if you went up to somebody and you had a Snickers bar, you either wanted to talk to them seriously about something, or you genuinely, were concerned about them in some way, and would, this was not just a light conversation. And they had a big bowl of Snickers in the reception area, so that anyone, and it really worked, because it became a metaphor for those conversations. A simple thing, but it was an organization between them. They decided that's what they wanted to do, and it worked.
And tasty.
And it was tasty as well. And it gives you that little bit boost of glucose before you go into that difficult conversation to help you have it.
Brilliant. You're touching on loads of really interesting things here, which is like, the first thing you talked about is motivation. And I guess what I was thinking there is like, who's responsible for the motivation there? Because sometimes training and learning is top down. Like, this is what we believe is the capability we need to develop in this organization. And then you've got intrinsic motivation. So it's like, what do I need to further my career, or whatever it is, to be the best in my role? What does motivation look like, and how do you build that motivation? Or is it just, it's either there or it's not?
So only an individual can build their own motivation. You can't motivate somebody else. You can put things in place that will help them feel motivated. And you've got intrinsic motivation, which is, I want to do this for me, for a reason I have. Extrinsic motivation is the kind of the reward piece. And that's what companies can do. They can reward people for doing things. But if people cannot see the connection between the training and their current role, or maybe their future role, or, it may be something, sometimes people see a connection in training that is, actually, this isn't going to really help me in my job, but this is going to be super helpful at home. Even that can work, but you have to tap into that. And I think a lot of organizations, they talk about training with the wrong language. So, for instance, this is one I've been talking to people about recently, psychological safety, a fascinating concept, marvelous, really interesting. But if you're an engineer, working on a plant somewhere, you don't care about psychological safety. What's that to me? I really don't care about that. But if you talk to the engineer in terms of, do you sometimes struggle to get your colleagues to help you with something? Or do you sometimes feel you can't trust them or they can't trust you? Then they go, yeah, I would actually like some help with that. But you don't start with the psychological safety. So I think that's one of the things that organizations do. We talk in terms of, L&D words or psychology words that aren't relevant to the people we're talking to. And then I think, the idea that everybody wants to learn the same thing, do the same thing is not true. People are motivated by very different things. So it's about tapping into their motivation and helping them see how that whatever it is they're doing. And I think one of the big challenges, yes, you have those courses that are aimed at helping you motivate, but how much training is compliance, mandatory? They make no effort to motivate people at all. It's just the only motivation is you must do this. And that gives other training a bad name.
We have a running joke on this podcast. My partner works for the NHS and she has to do compliance training. And I see her down there. She's not learning.
Nobody's learning. Nobody's learning. They've just worked out how to pass the tick box test. And it's pointless because the point of mandatory or point of that kind of safety training and things like that, it should save a life or it should stop your company from being, taken to court or something. It's stuff that really matters. But we do it in the most dry, dull, and you must do it. And there's, here's a whole pile of processes and procedures. And procedures are important. They matter. If you push the wrong button or pull the wrong lever, that matters. But if we just make it so boring that people just disengage from it, you may as well not do it.
And the second thread you got there, which is the E, which is experiment. I'm intrigued to sort of see that.
I think what's really interesting there is organizations have got a bit stuck in what I call the knowledge trap. Okay. They've got stuck in this idea that people need to have information, and people do need information, clearly. But, there's just this massive overwhelm of information and not enough in the next part. And experiment is an area where people do often get support, workshops and things do help with that. But it's this kind of being stuck in the content piece, the knowledge piece. And you hear people talk about content and knowledge all the time. And they're useful, but they're only the start of the process.
Yeah. And my sense of that is potentially it's getting worse with things like ChatGPT. Because it's much easier to create content and create knowledge. And, if you were creating it yourself, it might be quite short. And then you involve ChatGPT and it churns out this, excess of stuff. Yes. So my sense is things are getting, there's potentially a danger we go more.
There is a huge worrying potential for that indeed.
Yeah, and you touched on something which is important, that not all things that training gives you or learning gives you is equal, is it? And doesn't require the same method. So you talked about skills and knowledge and require two different approaches.
I think even skills have to start with knowledge. If you're going to learn how to buckle your shoe, or learn how to implement something at work, use a new process, or learn to communicate more effectively, it's still useful to have some information at the start. But that information may not be written information, but it's still useful to see, I've seen somebody else do that, or I've experienced that where I couldn't do it and I wanted to be able to do it. So you still need that knowledge piece, I think, but it's not necessarily information that you necessarily need to retain in your head.
And you talk about, because there's a lot of myths that surround neuroscience, aren't you? And listening to you and some of and reading the book as well. So some interesting things, actually, things like learning by rote can be quite effective, can't it, for a particular way of working? So sometimes we forget the fundamentals, don't we?
Yeah, I can still mostly do my, multiplication tables because I learned them by rote. They're just in there. Yeah.
Are there any other sort of myths or misconceptions about like neuroscience or learning that you often encounter?
There are quite a lot, but what's really interesting, so I have been asking the question, what do you know about your brain, for 25 years? And when I used to ask it 25 years ago, I got a lot of myths and I was constantly myth busting. Now people know a lot more than they used to, which is really, gratifying. I think people, they've kind of understood that, they understand that neuroplasticity happens, that our brains can change, which we used to think they couldn't. madness, but we used to think they couldn't. Things like the myth of, you only use 10% of your brain, that still comes up sometimes. And I just say, well, you're okay then if I remove the other 90%? You don't mind? Ones like that. I think the ones that are still quite prevalent are the kind of the left and right brain. You're a left brain person or a right brain person. No, you're not. You use both sides of your brain. Again, if you're left brained and I take out the right, do you mind? Yes, of course you do. So there are still some myths about, and I think what you just said, there are sort of myths, about the repetition thing. There are myths that have kind of come off from the myths. So, what was a myth and then somebody tries to explain it has then become, well, no, that's a myth. But absolutely, repetition is a good way to learn something that you just need to be able to recall it like that.
Context really matters, doesn't it, for these things?
Context is vital. Yes, context is really, really important. What's the context of what I'm learning, why I'm learning it, where I'm learning it, how I'm learning it?
I guess the other thing, if you're in the learning industry for any period of time, are fads. Suddenly
Yes.
Things that come out and it's like, oh, we've got to do this. And some come and go and some stick because there is some substance behind it. How does someone who's in that industry, really interrogate the evidence or understand that what they're doing is actually genuine or is actually a fad?
So I think that comes down to professionalism. And I think as learning professionals, it is our duty to understand the evidence base and how to get evidence and how to challenge evidence. So I think, adopting that kind of scientific mindset, and you don't necessarily need to be a scientist, but adopting that scientific mindset of, I'm going to check when I hear something, what's the evidence behind this? What's the evidence? Where did it come from? Who's saying this? For how long have they been saying it? Is this just a fad? Is it something that's going to go? What are they saying about it? Are they saying it's a magic bullet and it will absolutely, fix everything? And if it is, then it's probably a fad or at least a overhype. Is there some genuine research behind it? And even research, you still have to challenge research and sort of find out, was it double blind tested? Has it been replicated? There's lots of questions. And there's lots of stuff around in psychology at the moment about it's quite hard to replicate psychology studies. But you still have to try. You still have to think, well, what can we measure? What can we experiment with? What can we take from this? So I think the faddy thing, and you're right, it is a real thing in L&D. They love bright, shiny things. I mean, use your common sense. That seems a very old-fashioned thing to say, but, sometimes just, is this really, I think a few years ago, micro-learning was absolutely a thing. I remember everything was going to be on your mobile phone. Well, at the time, not even everybody had a mobile phone. I mean, this was quite some time ago now. So I think it's, there are horses for courses. And I think it's, this thing is going to be really useful here. And this is how we make that work. But it's not going to fix every single problem.
And with this in mind, asking for a friend, is unlearning a thing? Because a lot of people are sort of talking about that, which is like, you need to unlearn. And sometimes it can be like a term that it describes a process, but in a very cack-handed way.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
So the evidence is you can't really unlearn. It's not a thing.
Shall I let my friend know?
It's a topic that people talk about, and I know what they mean. You have to relearn or learn something new, or as I said before, build on the learning you already have to, learn how a new way to do this thing. But the evidence is that once those neural connections, so if you learned it properly in the first place and you've got those neural connections always persist. They're always there. They will weaken. And if you really learn something that replaces that behavior, then you can make that new behavior the stronger one, the one you will more likely turn to. But, under circumstances of stress, or if you go back into the environment where the other thing was the thing you did, environment's hugely important for our responses to the environment, our behavioral response. So that behavior will always be there. So you can't really unlearn something. It'll always be there. You can forget things, things can be forgotten, but most things, unless you've got, genuine damage to your brain in some way, they're still there. It's just you've kind of lost access to them, and sometimes that access comes back for all sorts of different. Go into the same environment, and that access will come back again.
So, just again, another thing that's discussed a lot in organisations, which I think would, again, just to get your perspective on it, is sort of intergenerational stuff. that, sometimes we often do this generation is in that way, and sometimes there are sort of stereotypes which are developed, which is, they're just that way. What's your experience? Does learning need to be specifically designed around the generations, or is it again a little bit lazy shorthand?
I think it's a lazy shorthand, and I think the evidence is there isn't a great deal of difference between Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z and whatever I am, baby boomers. Again, it depends what you're learning. It depends why you're learning it. And it depends on the context, to come back to the context again of what's happening. So, I mean, it is definitely the case that the young, the generation younger than me, or the multiple generations younger than me, are using different tools to do learning. They access TikTok, they access YouTube to do things. But that doesn't mean that I can't do that. I do regularly look at, I've not addicted myself to TikTok yet, but I regularly look at YouTube to help me do things because it's a really useful tool. And I think what's changing is, for instance, our ability to pay attention to things. We're more distracted by things now, but that's not just young people who are more distracted. We're all more distracted because there are more distractions in the world. So I think that you have to do this differently for different people is a myth. I mean, I think that the neurodiversity thing, that's a different thing altogether. And I think that is important. That is really important to pay attention to, because most neurodiversity sits on a spectrum of normal or not normal. And if you can design and deliver something that appeals to a neurodiverse audience, you're actually helping everybody. So a colleague of mine has ADHD, she said, we're like the canaries in the mine. We detect these things and they affect us strongly, but actually everybody is impacted by it. So, if you're writing, if your text, for instance, is suitable for somebody with dyslexia, it actually makes it easier for everybody. It's just that they were more disadvantaged by it in the first place.
I think it's really true. My son has ADHD, so I've learned so much in terms of guiding him through his revision and helping him work through that. You then find it's applicable, the same techniques are applicable to people who aren't neurodiverse and don't have ADHD, but struggle with procrastination, or it's just in an extreme form. So yeah,
indeed.
I feel like we should run a special episode on dopamine.
That is a whole subject one.
And again, it's misdefined and people describing it either positively or negatively, but the definitions aren't crisp enough, are they?
No. And dopamine has so many multiple impacts on our brain and body in so many different ways. Yes, I mean, it's called the reward. It's always called the reward neurotransmitter, isn't it? But it does more than that. I mean, basically, people who have Parkinson's disease cannot initiate movement because of a lack of dopamine. So it's motivation, but it's the motivation to actually physically move as well as other things. So yes, it's a very, very complex neurotransmitter.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback.
Question we'd love to ask you is, what was your journey into neuroscience? Like, how did you sort of discover it, and how did you sort of develop until you were sort of a leading voice in the area?
So I was always interested in people, and I kind of was always interested in science. So even at school, I was really interested in the science, and I liked the biological sciences. I loved biology at school. I thought it was really fascinating. I can still remember how I, revised my digestion by thinking about how one digests things, as you went through the day. And then when I went to university, I studied a psychology degree that was a science-based psychology degree. And I was very lucky that we had a very strong neuroscience team in there, and they were really looking at, how brains work. One of the things we did look at was dopamine and Parkinson's disease. So we were looking at that through animal models. So I just got really interested in how the brain works. When I left university, I got a job in IT. So I was spending less time actually, actively studying it, but I would just still keep reading and finding out, because it was just something I found utterly, because it's always changing and evolving. I just kept up to date with it. And then when I kind of went into the training world, it just made I was starting to hear some of the myths, and I kept thinking, but that clearly can't be true, because my psychology, the science part of my psychology is saying that's rubbish, that's silly. So I began to get more interested in that. And like I say, I define neuroscience quite broadly. So yeah, it's just been, and it's, for me, it's always about the practical application. It's not just learning about the brain for the sake of learning about the brain. It's learning about it. Well, what does this mean in terms of what we actually do to help people learn better?
Going on that practical application, a question I had, you talked earlier about the role of managers in helping people, of creating that context where people can apply what they're learning. So if there's somebody listening who's about to, potentially invest in training or development for their people, their team, sending on a training course, what can they do practically as a manager to create the context? What advice would you give on that?
So have a conversation with them first about, what the manager thinks the training can do, and coach them to see what they think the training will do. So if the manager has decided that they need the training, or the person has come to them, that's going to be a different coaching kind of question. So yeah, coach them into helping them find their purpose, and then whatever that training might be, check in. How are you getting on? How's that impacting? Have you got a goal for this training? And actually really making sure that by the time they get back, well, I mean, training's very different now, isn't it? In the old days, it used to be you go away for a 5-day course and then you get back. But by the time you come away out of a 1-hour digital session, is there an opportunity to apply that, a genuine work opportunity to apply that in the workplace? And that manager can support that, which means it's work for managers. But for managers, there's a benefit, because you're going to get people, if you support them to do this, you're going to get people you can delegate to. You're going to get people who you can rely on to do the job. If you don't support it, you don't know whether you can do that, and you're then left doing all the things and having that kind of oppressive feeling of like, I've got to do everything because my people aren't good enough. I'm not saying all managers say that, but there's that's the extreme. So yeah, so support them as they're going through, make sure there's real opportunities for them to apply. Be interested in it yourself. Best of all, get them to teach you what they've learned, because that's absolutely the best way for them to start to consolidate that learning. So say, look, actually, I'm really interested in what you're learning on this course. Explain it to me. Tell me what's happening. Show me what you've been doing. That would be such a useful thing to do. And do you know what? You've done that. Why don't we share that with the rest of the team? Do you know what? I'll give you half an hour in the next team meeting to share that with the team, because that will really focus them on, what did I learn? How have I learned it? So I think those are the practical things that managers can do.
And you started your career at a really exciting time in IT. How did that sort of inform your approach to learning?
What, when I started my L&D career or my IT career?
Both.
Because after I left university, I went and I worked in IT. So I was a programmer, I was a coder, I was an analyst.
Oh, wow.
I was a manager of a technical team, where I used my psychology, and I guess I was helping people to learn sort of soft skills just by default. Yeah, totally. And that's why I'm interested in technology, because I've always been interested in technology. But I only went into technology because at that time in the 1980s, there were a lot of technology jobs. So it seemed a good thing to go into. And it was kind of quite a groovy thing at that point.
Yeah, and many people's experience of training of IT is not always the best, is it? In terms of, because it's one of those things that lends itself to potentially be taught in a dry way, doesn't it?
That was exactly why when I've always had this interest in learning. My family were all teachers and things, so I've always had an interest in learning, and I had the most terrible training in IT. Some really, really awful, terrible training. And I used to think, well, who would want to be a trainer? Because this must be a horrible job. It's awful. And so I never ever looked at training as a role until I was given this job of IT support and training manager. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do the training bit. I'll just employ somebody. They can do that bit. And I was like trying just to ignore it. And I took on my first trainer, and this just still makes me laugh. I knew nothing about training. I said, what do you need? And he said, a lectern. Julie bought him. He told me that was what he needed. I must admit, I thought, not quite how I do it, but anyway. And then I took on a second trainer who was just the complete opposite. She was a really facilitative person. She engaged with people. She made IT training engaging, fun. And from her, I learned a lot. And then I kind of, I realized that and then I went to a CIPD conference. I thought, well, I ought to go to a conference. And it was probably just the exhibition, actually. And I walked around this exhibition, and of course, a lot of it was HR at that time. And there were a lot of kind of, people in suits standing on stands. And there was a pirate ship. And I thought, that's really curious. Why is there a pirate ship there? I went up and talked to them, and they were finance trainers. They trained finance, also equally prone to being very dull and boring. But they were doing it using what at the time was called accelerated learning. And I thought, well, if you can do that for finance, you can do that with IT. So my mission at that point was to transform the IT world and help them deliver better training. That didn't quite happen because big companies like Microsoft and Oracle and things, they didn't care. They were delivering their training as they always delivered it. They may have changed now, I don't know. But you're right, Gavin. That technical training and technical training is still, well, even good training. I have joined training programs or training events where even interesting topics they've made boring.
Which
I
is
used
a
to always
skill.
say there's no such thing as a boring topic, there's only boring training. And I truly still believe that.
Yeah. The question I had for you is around the social aspect of learning and how important it is to learn in groups. What does neuroscience tell us about that? Because we do a lot of work with groups, and we see the power of interaction. So just wondering about the science and the neuroscience of that.
So I think there's some really interesting science around that. Some of it is around just, the human connection. We are human, we are used to connecting, we like connecting, and how we connect digitally. We're connecting quite well digitally because we're probably all doing it quite regularly, but you still don't connect in quite the same way because you can't touch a person, you can't smell them. The visuals are slightly different to how they are in the real world. So I think there is something genuine about physically being in the same space. Learning collaboratively can be really valuable because you learn from other people, you learn from their, that's one of the things I'm sure any trainer has seen, that you get a group of people together and you say, why do you want to learn this? And they say, well, I've got this problem, it's kind of like I want to solve it. And then somebody else says, actually, I've got that one as well. And then that, just that acknowledgement that other people are facing this as well, that is really uplifting for people and really heartening. And I think that's what collaborative training can do. But also in collaborative training, you get that ability to challenge things. Even as the trainer, you might say something and somebody will say, but actually that doesn't work in our system. And then that's a really interesting learning point, because you can say, okay, well, let's work out together how in your system this does work. So I think there's huge benefit in doing that. There are challenges too, in terms of, you get people who need to move faster than the rest of the group or need to move slower than the rest of the group. And I think that can be managed. And some people do prefer, I think, to learn on their own, but I think you run the risk of not getting the broader, the sort of serendipitous learning that you get when you're working collaboratively.
You have done a lot of things in your career. You've written books, you've set up labs, you've developed technology, you've done a highly successful LinkedIn course as well. What kind of brings you most joy in your work?
Seeing light bulb moments, when people just kind of go, oh, that's really interesting, I think I can use that. And then when they come back later and say, what you taught me in that, whatever it was, whether it was a session or a whole program, whatever it might be, what you taught me has really changed the way I do things and really helped me do things. So it's that kind of being helpful.
So there's obviously lots of advances happening in neuroscience all the time, I guess. What's particularly interesting you in the field at the moment?
So in the field of neuroscience and science of the brain and body, I'm just really interested in the work that's going on that is beginning to show us far better how, it's obviously brain and body are connected, but there's some really interesting stuff going on that really show, how our microbiome, what we eat, that microbiome within us, how that really impacts on our thinking, on our behaviors, even on our behaviors. So I think that's fascinating. So it's that kind of holistic thing. And I read a book fairly recently, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain, which I just really loved, because it's really talking about, our brains are they're not just a thing that lives in a bottle. They're a thing that lives in a physical entity that lives in a world that is a physical entity. And it's about how all that impacts on us and changes how we behave and what we do. And I just think that's, very, very engaging, very interesting.
Yeah, and in the book you talk about how you can stack the odds or probability that you will get high performance from your brain by doing things like exercise, for
Yeah.
example, or good sleep. So, because exercise produces a particular thing, doesn't it, that helps it
Neuro
function?
human-derived neurotrophic factor. That's it.
I didn't even dare.
It's like fertilizer for your brain cells, and it particularly works on your hippocampal brain cells, which have a tendency to be able to recreate, to grow new ones. So yeah, if you can exercise, then you are supporting your brain to actually grow new memory cells.
Which is really powerful, isn't it? Because I think a lot of managers' jobs, it's quite cerebral, isn't it? But the tendency is the more difficult the problems, the more work there is to be done, the more hours we throw out of it. But I guess it's kind of the law of diminishing returns almost, isn't it? Because you're not giving your brain what it needs to actually function well, or giving it the space to think as well.
And I think the space to think thing is really important, because that's about making so when you're I was talking to somebody earlier on today about flow, when you're in that kind of mind where you're just really focused, and you really, you lose track of everything that's going on around you and you're in it. And that's a very specific state you can get into. But for most of us, when we're concentrating, that's really hard work. And when we're concentrating on something, it's our brains become energy deprived, but also you have less access to the rest of your brain. So you've got access to what you're focusing on, but all the rest of your brain, you've stopped kind of sending messages to. Whereas when you take that break, you go for a walk, or you go and make a coffee and you're just sort of daydreaming, or even if you're talking to somebody else, then your brain goes into what's called default mode. And then when it goes into default mode, it's much more likely to make other connections. So that's why when often you take a break, you come back and you think, oh, yes, I'd forgotten about that because I've been focusing on this. I'd forgotten about that. That impacts on this. Yeah, that's really important. I need to bring that into account.
Which is why
But
you tend to solve difficult business problems in the shower rather than at your desk, isn't it?
yes, yes. And also, we spend too much time sitting these days. I mean, I should be standing at my standing desk. I've got a standing desk, but it's so easy to sit, isn't it? Interestingly, though, if you really do have to think about something difficult, so they've done some really interesting research where they've been giving people, maths problems, and people can be walking or running and solving maths problems. But as soon as the maths problem becomes really complex, they stop, because they really need to put all their energy into their brain, and they can't put the energy so it's energy and kind of activation, attention into the keeping your body moving. So, sometimes stopping is the right thing to do if you really have to think hard.
I have a burning question. If I don't ask this question, I'll really regret it at the end of it. So you just touched on it, which is the whole art of flow. And one of the big things is that, if you look at people's diary, it is a disaster, isn't it? You look at it, there's no space to think, it's back to back. One of those things is actually providing that space for flow to be created. That kind of, I think Cal Newport would kind of describe it as deep work, isn't it? Like kind of, what can you do to stack the odds of probability that you can get into that state? What can you do that might enable you to allow your brain to do that kind of work and thinking?
So I think identify when that's most likely to happen for you. For some people, that's the morning. For some people, that's the afternoon. So identify when that is, and then block time. Block time to do it, and then do it, and make sure you're not being disturbed. And make sure it's something that you can do. So I think flow has to be something that you've got a goal, you're capable of achieving it, but it's slightly challenging. And that's when you really get into flow. But you have to stop the distraction, but work out when is your time of day that you're most likely to get into that flow.
And I think you were sort of saying, because there was one thing for example, there's a myth that the elderly's memory reduces quite a lot. And you were sort of saying that they were doing the experiments about memory in the afternoon, which isn't conducive for peak memory experience. Whereas the students that were doing it, sorry, can you tell that story much better than I can?
So, I mean, it is true that as you get older, your brain definitely changes and your memory is not quite as agile as it was when you were younger. However, a lot of research happens at universities, and it's undergraduates doing research. So undergraduates, on the whole, younger people tend to prefer their day to start later and end later too. Older people, as you get older, you tend to wake up earlier and go to bed earlier. And so, students were setting up experiments and comparing students and older people, but they were doing the experiments in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, the older people were just about ready for a little nap. So they weren't performing as well as they might have done, whereas the students, they'd just had a good long lie in, they were fresh and lively. So somebody realized that this was a pattern and said, okay, well, let's see what happens if we run these same experiments, in the morning when these older people are feeling bright and alert and, they've just been for a walk and feeling great. And yes, there is still a difference, but it's not the kind of the enormous gap that it appeared to be. And I think that's another, that's just another example of context, really, that, what's the context in which you're measuring these things? What's the context in which you're exploring these ideas and looking at that? And that's a really good piece of sort of scientific observation that this particular lady had.
I've got a question. You mentioned measuring, and that made me think. So one of the challenges that L&D professionals, OD professionals, HR are continually finding is how do we measure the impact that the learning and the development activity we're doing or investing in for our people has. Is there anything neuroscience can tell us about that, or any ideas?
I'm not sure it's neuroscience. I think it's genuine data science, and it's thinking about what do we want to measure, and it's starting with the end in mind. And the end of training should be that we have, a group of people who know or can do X, Y, or Z, because this is what the business, we're talking about business training. I'm not talking about learning for the sake of just because you love learning, but business learning. We have to get these people to move from where they are now to where they need to be. There's a change happening. So what do we want? So we want X people to have this skill. What does that skill look, sound, and feel like? How will they express that skill? What are the behaviors we expect to see? And start with that. So if you know what behaviors you expect to see, then you can assess, so who's already got those behaviors? We don't need to train them. Who hasn't got those behaviors? Are they capable of learning those behaviors? And if they are, then we have to go about, working out how to do it. So it starts for me with, what's your business need? What are the behaviors you're looking for? And we call those transfer objectives. So what's the objective of the skills or the knowledge you're trying to transfer? What's the objective? And only then, when you've got those really clear and they're really formulated, and they're formulated in a really concrete way that everybody can see them. So you can create rubrics so that, managers can see that, oh yeah, I can see that Danny can do whatever it is I've asked her to do. I can see that. And these are the things I'm expecting to see as she's doing that. So, people say it's hard to measure, and it's not necessarily easy, and you're looking for data from different data points. But that's what you have to have at the beginning. And then if you've got that, then you say, okay, so now we can start to build a learning journey or an intervention or something that will help us get there. And, at what level do we want these people to have these skills? And we're not expecting, we can't expect them to have mastery of the skills within 2 weeks or a month or potentially even a year, depending on what it is. So, gauging the level you want people to be at. And then start measuring it and start assessing all the way along. So don't just wait until the end and then say, can they do it? But keep assessing all the way along. Have they moved from A to B? Have they moved from step 1 to step 2? And use data from different data points. Because, we have so much data available to us now. And especially, now that we've got AI, built into, or it is being built into everything, that can start to track. We can start to do sentiment assessments. So do people feel confidence is really important when people are learning skills. Can we assess the confidence of how people feel that they're doing with these things? So it's about bringing all these different data points together, and then you can get to the end. And you're never going to be able to say, oh yes, that was absolutely 100% down to this amazing training course. But if you can say, well, look, we can see progress, we can see change, then And maybe also the CEO changed or a process changed at the same time. But at least we can see there has been some progress, and we're not just measuring, did people like it? Who cares? And, did they complete it? Who cares?
Which is liberating, is it? Because it doesn't have to be aesthetically pretty for people to learn, does it?
No, and it doesn't need, it doesn't need, you're not trying to get 100%. You're not trying to get 100% of people to be all 100% of the same thing. What you're looking for is progress. And progress is motivating. So if you can show learners, look, you've moved, along these steps, then that makes them think, Oh, okay, that's good. So, measurement isn't just for the organization. Measurement can really help the learner too.
From your perspective, what can you see that is new in L&D at the moment? So if you're a learning and development manager and you feel that your programs are a little bit stagnant, a little bit stuck, what's coming up over the horizon that could potentially be a game changer or something that's going to, motivate learners in a new way or new medias?
Well, I'm going to say the completely obvious thing, which is AI, because it's affecting everybody, isn't it? And it's certainly affecting L&D too. And I think you hear people saying we could just throw everything out we've ever done and start from scratch. Now, that's never going to happen. But how can we start to use AI to really support the things that we want people to do? But if you're going to use AI, you've got to be doing the right things in the first place. So if you're really stuck in that knowledge trap and you're just using AI to create more content, you're just making it worse. You're not helping. But if you start to use AI to help you with assess, who needs to go on this journey, how far do they need to go through this journey, which bits of the journey they need to do, which bits they not need to do. If you can use the AI to, so I said earlier on, I think that I was doing a role play recently with AI. It was fantastic. It was really good. I was asking it to help me with listening skills. I told it, you are a listening skills expert. Help me improve my listening skills, role play it with me. It was fabulous. It was really clever. And I didn't have to disturb a colleague to do it or anything like that. I think there's some real value there in terms of the application bit, the applying it in the workplace. You can use AI to nudge people to remember this is what you're supposed to be doing. Remember, here are the 3 steps to help you complete this process, or the 3 steps to help you have that conversation. And because we all carry our phones with us all the time, it can be really used, and it's certainly useful in terms of things like spaced repetition. So when I first started in training, I knew about spaced repetition. I always thought it was really important. So I used to literally, at the end of every training program, I would create a set of questions and then I would email them to people at kind of spaced intervals, which I thought was really good. But I had no idea whether they were answering them, whether, I couldn't track back. And then when we got a platform, then it could send them and it could track them, but I was still having to invent the questions. Now you can just say to AI, look, here's the content from this program. You create the questions, and it can do it, and they're good. Okay, you've got to validate them, you've got to check they're okay, but and you can ask it to create different sorts of questions, create scenarios. It's fantastic. So I think what we can use AI for is all the bits that L&D have found kind of a bit more challenging to do, because they're not the bits that are in the classroom or the e-learning. They're the bits in the organization. But I think we can really use it to help with those bits.
Nothing creates more anxiety in a training room than saying to the participants, now we'll do a role play.
Yeah. Horrible. Yeah. Never say that. No.
And just sort of come full circle, you mentioned at the beginning you do like learning audits. Like what are those and how do they work, and what's the benefit for organizations when you go through it?
So it's basically an opportunity to kind of look at what you're currently doing with your learning culture, or perhaps with particular programs. Sometimes we address it from a top level, kind of, let's have a look at the learning culture. And it's basically going in and starting to ask people, what do you think about training? What do you, how do you feel about the learning opportunities you're given? And starting to ask them impact questions. So after you did this particular sort of training, how much of it are you currently actively using? What helped you to actively, so you're beginning to tap into, questions as to what helped. You're beginning to get data on, are managers supporting or are managers not supporting? You're beginning to get information and data on, is the training program itself, how much of that was useful and is actually used, and how much of it was just fluff that somebody thought would be useful and it isn't used. And then we're also looking at kind of, the data that's in the organization already. How can we use that to help you start to look at these transfer objectives? And I think for a lot of organizations, just beginning to understand about transfer objectives is a bit of a game changer in the first place. And then looking at, we sometimes look at their tech, is the tech supporting an evidence-based approach, or is the tech literally just overwhelming you with more content? And so there's lots and lots of questions. In terms of impact, it's what organizations do afterwards. And all the ones we've ever worked with have always said, we've shifted they haven't shifted their culture immediately. But what we always offer is, here's some first, easy easy, quick things you can do that will make a difference. And that's often things like, instead of doing a happy sheet, you can still do the happy sheet if you want. If you just want to get that kind of immediate feedback, it's not a bad thing. But do a 1 month and a 2 month impact audit questionnaire. Simple, easy. You won't get all the answers back from everybody, but you will get sufficient to tell you whether that course was being helpful. And then we offer kind of longer term recommendations to actually start to think about, what do you need to do with your learning strategy? And we're always trying to shift them towards using a more evidence-based approach. They don't necessarily need to use our gear model, but just start to think about things from a more evidence-based perspective.
Clearly, you give so much to others in terms of sharing your expertise and your insights. How do you invest in your own learning?
That's a really good question. I was thinking about that earlier on. I do sometimes join learning courses. So I did a really great transfer course with Ina Weinbauer-Heidel and the Transfer Institute, I think they're called, a couple of years ago. That was really good. This week, I started on a AI for Women course, online course. I do a lot of reading. So I do a huge amount of reading. I go to conferences and things, and you always learn new things there. I talk to a lot of people, and I guess I listen to a lot of people. And I think one of the best ways to learn, and it's one of the things I suggested, if you're wanting to help managers, is if you have to train something, you really have to learn how to do it and how to help other people to do it. So I think one of the best ways I've learned is through training other people.
Yeah. One thing we like to ask, is there a particular resource, a book or a podcast or something else that's had a real impact on you that you'd recommend that others kind of have a look at?
There's lots. How many do you want?
Well, you can recommend your own book for starters, but
okay, well, yeah, all right. I'll recommend my book. I think the one that I'm going to choose at the moment, because it's super practical, and it's this one, What Makes Training Really Work, and I just mentioned it, Ina Weinbauer-Heidel. It's 12 Levers of Transfer Effectiveness, and it's just, it's again very practical. It's very easy to read. It's very practical. And it's evidence-based, it's research-based. So I think, anybody could read that. And I think that helps from an OD level and an L&D approach.
Last question, and it's a question we ask all of our guests. What advice would you give someone who's considering a career or venturing into neuroscience?
I would say get an evidence base behind you. Begin to understand enough of the science of learning, enough of the science of change, of behaviour change, that you can initiate, that you can challenge, and that you can innovate, knowing that you've got a good evidence base behind you. It doesn't mean you'll get absolutely everything right, but it means that you're more likely to have the impact that you want to have.
Well, I just want to say a huge thank you, Stella. It's been just really insightful. It's been a really lovely conversation. There's so many different takeaways from this as well. And I think you've sort of shed a light on a huge area, and it would have got people really excited and really hungry to learn more as well. Particularly a really exciting time in the development of both neuroscience and learning and development as well. Danny, what do you like to take away from the conversation?
Gosh, so much. Normally I scribble things down as I'm going through that I'm going to mention at the end, but I was so captivated by the conversation. Can't admit it. But I think things like, the context being so important, and the, really amplifying the role of manager in terms of helping that learning transfer. And I think the gear model, I think if people can start looking at that when they're thinking about, interventions and solutions, then that's going to add so much more value if you can think about the whole piece rather than just a training course or an online learning module, just seeing it in the context of that gear model.
Right. Yeah. And all those things that Danny said, I think one of the things I'm sort of taking away is the need for learning and development teams to really develop the courage to look at their own practice and sort of remove the ego away, or how if you're feeling insecure, is that we have to do the right thing for our learners and our organizations. And therefore we have a professional duty to take a step back and look at our practice and think about how we can optimize it. And people like you, Stella, are here to guide people on that journey. It doesn't have to be scary, does it?
It's not scary, and it's about taking small steps. So yes, you just suggested look at the gear model. That doesn't mean you have to implement every possible thing on that, but if you just take some steps to stretch it, then so yeah, it's about taking small steps. I mean, big ambitions, but take small steps.
Thank you. So there's so many things that you're doing that people can sort of follow your work on. Where would you like to signpost people? Because I know the people watching this will have a real thirst to follow up and read and watch and maybe even contact you as well. What's the best thing for people to do?
So LinkedIn is usually the best place to find me, and I'm Stella Collins on LinkedIn. I'm quite easy to find, so that's easy. I have just started a new little website that's more for the keynote stuff, but also the learning impact audits. So I can send you the link for that. So yeah, those two places are the places to contact me. Or
Brilliant.
I'm at conferences, so I'll be at Learning Technologies. Come and talk to me there.
Great. And as part of the research, I've watched a lot of your keynotes and they are very, very good. So if you do want a compelling speaker, please do consider bringing Stella along. And it's not just the quality of the keynote, it's the answering of the questions that people, because people have so many personal questions. As you can tell from ours, we're asking for a friend today. It's that it's really the ability to really sort of take people's individual context questions as well, so which is really important.
Yeah.
So thank you, Stella. We really appreciate it. This has really added value to our brilliant portfolio of guests from around the world as well. So thank you. If you are watching this podcast and you're watching it and you're thinking, I really know someone that would really get value from this, then please share it with them. We always get amazing stats every week of people sharing this with others. So share it widely to L&D people, to neuroscience students, to learners, to managers. People will find this really, really useful as well. So thank you. But most of all, thank you, Stella. It's been brilliant. We've loved it. It's been great. And we're really happy. So thank you.
Thank you both. It's been a really lovely afternoon.